D-Day Center Assault. The 1st Marines fought to secure the left flank. The 7th Marines battled to isolate and reduce enemy defenses on the southern end of Peleliu. The 5th Marines were tasked with driving across the airfield to cut the island in half, reorient north, and secure the island's eastern half. The 2-5 Marines, under Major Gordon Gale, landed on Orange Beach 2 and advanced east through scrub jungle and dunes. They moved in and out of the anti-tank barrier to the west edge of the clearing surrounding the airfield. Gale's battalion passed through the lines of the 3-5 Marines and attacked scattered resistance through the scrub in dugouts and bomb shelters near the southern end of the airfield. The 3rd Battalion's mission was to clear that scrub and maintain contact with the 3-7 Marines on the right flank, while the 2-5 Marines advanced across the open area to reach the far side of the island. The 2-5 Marines advanced in the center and right, fighting entirely across the island by mid-afternoon. They kept contact with the 1-5 Marines and moved to reorient their attack northward. The Japanese anti-tank ditch along the center and right of the Orange Beaches was notable because of the several command posts along its length. The 1st Tank Battalion's M48A1 Shermans, a third of which were left behind at the last moment, finally crossed the reef. These tanks had developed special reef crossing maneuvers in anticipation of terrain obstacles. Moving the fire and logistical support onto the beach was challenging and under direct observation from Japanese observers. This was an inescapable risk because of Peleliu's terrain. As long as the enemy had observation posts atop the Ermer-Brogel Point over the airfield and beach, there was no alternative but to advance rapidly and coordinate fire support. The rapid beach advance caused heavy casualties. General Rupertus' concern for early momentum seemed to be correct. Marines on the left flank assaulted the foot of the pocket's ridges and swiftly got to the crest. In the center, the 5th Marines advanced and secured all likely routes to outflank the pocket. In the south, the 7th Marines destroyed the now cut-off forces before they could regroup and join the fight in central Peleliu. The 5th Marines moved across the airfield to the western edge of the lagoon. They separated the airfield area from the eastern peninsula. They created a line of attacking Marines across the eastern and northern part of the island, believed to be the center of the enemy's strength. Colonel Henneken's 7th Marines pushed south and divided the Japanese forces. Henneken's troops were fully engaged and mostly concealed against enemy observation. It was becoming clear that the D-Day line objectives would not be met in either the north or south. General Rupertus was alarmed by the loss of his momentum, and he ordered the 2-7, his last uncommitted infantry battalion, under Colonel Spencer Berger, into the fight. No commander on shore felt a need for the 2-7 Marines. Colonel Henneken cleared an assembly area for them where they wouldn't be in the way. General Rupertus was now fully committed. He told his staff that he'd shot his bolt. On the crowded beachhead, more troops were not needed. They needed more room to maneuver them and more artillery. Rupertus decided to land himself and the key elements of his command group on shore. His chief of staff, Colonel John Selden, convinced the general to stay on the flagship because it was too dangerous, so Rupertus ordered Colonel Selden ashore. The shortage of LVTs stalled the timely landing of the following waves. Neither Selden's small command post group nor Berger's 2-7 Marines could get past the transfer line. The landing craft had to return to the ships, despite their orders to land. At 1700, Colonel Nakagawa launched his counterattack. Marine commanders had been alerted to the Japanese capability to make an armored attack on D-Day and were well prepared. The enemy assault came from north of the airfield and headed south across the 1st Marines line on the eastern edge of the airfield clearing. This attack went directly into the 5th Marine sector, where the 1-5 was dug in across the southern area of the airfield. Marines opened up on the enemy attackers' infantry and tanks. A bazooka gunner in front hit 2 tanks. The CO of the 1-5 Marines had his tanks enfilade behind the front lines. They fired on the enemy armor, running through the front lines as they advanced. The Marines' lines held, and they fired on the enemy infantry and tanks with all available weapons. Major John Gustafson of the 2-5 was in the forward command post halfway across the airfield and had his tank platoon close at hand. While the enemy had not yet come into his zone, he launched a platoon of tanks into the fight. In minutes, it was over. The enemy tanks were destroyed, and the Japanese infantry was ripped apart. While Colonel Nakagawa's attack was bold, it was a failure. Even where the Japanese tanks broke through Allied lines, the Marines did not retreat. Instead, all anti-tank fire of every caliber concentrated on the enemy armor. Japanese light tanks were blown apart into pieces on the battlefield. Over 100 were destroyed, although that figure may be exaggerated because of the amount of fire directed their way. Each Marine anti-tank gunner and grenadier thought they destroyed each tank they fired at, and reported it that way. With the Japanese counterattack repulsed and the enemy in shambles, Marines resumed their attack. They moved north along the eastern half of the airfield and advanced halfway up the length of the clearing before stopping to reorganize for the night. This was the farthest advance of the day over favorable terrain on the division's front. This advance provided the needed space for logistics and artillery deployment to support the next day's attack. But this quick advance left a hole in the right flank. The 3-5 Marines were supposed to keep contact with the north-facing 2-5, but the 3-5 command and control had been destroyed. The battalion's XO, Major Robert Ashe, was killed earlier in the day from a direct hit into his LVT. When the Japanese attack started, a mortar barrage hit the 3-5 command post in the anti-tank ditch and killed several staff officers and caused the evacuation of the battalion commander. At 1700, the 3-5 Marine companies weren't in contact with each other, nor their battalions. The 5th Marine CO ordered his XO, Colonel Lewis Walt, to take command of the 3-5 and redeploy them in between the gap of the 5th and 7th Marines. Walt moved the 2nd Battalion's Reserve Company to his right flank in a tie-in position to form a more continuous regimental line. By 2200, he came under several sharp counterattacks from central and southern defenders throughout the night. Enemy attacks came from the north and south. None had any significant success, but were persistent enough to require an ammunition resupply. At dawn, dozens of Japanese bodies laid ripped to pieces north of the Marines' lines. Elsewhere across the front, there were more menacing night counterattacks. None drove the Marines back or penetrated Allied lines in significant strength. In the south, the 7th Marines expected substantial night attacks from the enemy battalion opposing them. Marines were dug in and in strength. They had communications to call in fire support, including naval gunfire and star shell illumination. They easily turned back the sporadic enemy attacks. At the end of the first 12 hours ashore, the 1st Marine Division held its beachhead across their projected front. Marine positions were strong everywhere except on the extreme left flank. General Smith from his forward command post, had communication with all 3 regimental commanders. The report he received from Colonel Puller was not a realistic assessment of the 1st Marines' weak hold on the point. This was because of Colonel Puller's own limited information. Besides all 3 infantry regiments, the 1st Division had 3 battalions of light artillery emplaced on shore. All 30 tanks were also now on shore. The shore party was operating on the beach under sporadic enemy fire and full daylight observation. The division was preparing to press their advance on D+1. Their objective was to capture the commanding crests on the left, advance farther into the center, and destroy isolated enemy defenders in the south. By the end of the day, at least 2 colonels on Peleliu had misleading information about their situations and gave inaccurate reports to their superiors. When General Smith finally got a telephone wire into the 1st Marines command post, he was told the regiment had secured the beachhead and was on the objective line. He was not told about the gaps in his lines, nor of the gravity of the 1st Division struggle on the point, where 38 Marines battled to keep the position. Colonel Nakagawa reported that the Marines' landings attempt had been routed. He also reported that his brave counterattack had thrown the Marines into the sea.